So we've covered the statements that were made in a neutral way in People. We covered the way the New York Post is kind of using opinions in headline space and front pages to contour feelings about things, even while they're simultaneously, you saw the list I brought up when I was in that section, they're simultaneously actually reporting on the trial itself somewhat neutrally, like this is what happened. But the headline items at that place are getting the opinions that say things like, the dream of Johnny Depp is dead and whatnot. We talked about the meta context. We talked about Washington Post and Kotaku. Now I want to talk about a little bit about how they're presenting experts and people that primarily have psychological expertise to give you hints at the ways you should be thinking about this. I actually think this is a pretty good article. It doesn't go too far in editorializing what these people say, but I'd be interested in taking your all's thoughts on some of the things that come out here. So you get this summary. We know this already. According to Dr. Jill Huntley Taylor, a legal analyst and the CEO of Taylor Trial Consulting. So, Rob, I got a question. They say this is a trial strategy and jury consulting firm for civil and criminal cases. Do you have any notion of what a body like this does in practice?
Honestly, they probably do a bunch of jury polling. They do public polling to try and create their narrative, and they probably have somebody who observes a lot of court time who can give you reports on how juries like to hear testimony or how juries process testimony based on the metrics, based on how the jury is composed.
Okay. Interesting. Because I saw that and I said, well, I wonder how that looks. But that makes a lot of sense. It's PR specifically for a trial scenario and setting up how your messages are going to be received from the sounds of things. The first and most obvious truth: jurors must be convinced whether Depp abused her. Yes. And I thought there's something interesting here, though. If jurors conclude that this was a mutually abusive relationship, which I know chat doesn't like as a term, we're going to talk about that as part of this article. Some may see her op-ed as technically correct. So sure. It's combative, it's toxic, mutual abuse. Yes, I was a domestic violence victim, even if I gave as good as I got, which Johnny still has out there. However, other jurors may believe, and I've never thought this is one of the things I really like. What Heard wrote was a half-truth and therefore, brackets, deceptive. Sufficiently deceptive for legal purposes, right? Yep. What do you think of that?
Yep.
I'm in the second paragraph. The funny thing is, or the second sentence, the funny thing about it is, if this trial started all over again and Amber Heard didn't take the stand, then I'm in the first sentence. That you can get jurors that say this was mutually abusive, but Amber wasn't technically incorrect. However, Amber took the stand. And when she did that and she gave that massive recitation of how significant this is, if I come to the conclusion that was mutually abusive, I'm looking at her and I'm saying that what you put in that op-ed based on what you just said is not true.
Okay. Yeah. That's an interesting counterfactual. The defense just stands up and says, you know what? We're so confident that this just represents a toxic relationship. We're resting.
And that's one of the biggest, that's why probably one of her biggest missteps was actually filing the counterclaims. She would not have had any kind of legal burden. Her legal team could have just said, he's on the attack here and we don't have to prove anything, and just basically done a lot of like soft defending to make this more into a muddy middle. But by countersuing, she created all kinds of problems and she put all kinds of burdens on herself.
That's very interesting. See, I hadn't thought about that either. This is why it's so fun in lawsuits.
We like having multiple voices on these.
The second challenge, as described by this particular person, is the focus of the lawsuit, the op-ed itself. To prevail in court, Depp has to prove malice on Heard's part. The testimony that she initially wanted his name included in the op-ed may suggest malice. So that, if you recall, is the ACLU deposition that talks about the process here and says essentially, I want it to talk more about Johnny Depp. And the ACLU joins in on that by basically saying, well, the soft version, we're not going to get into a big paper, give or take. But the second part of this is also what I found interesting. But the timing prior to her movie release may suggest her real motive was to benefit herself. I have never thought of the Aquaman recency as being essentially proof or evidence that it was solely marketing, and that should mean that you didn't have malice against Johnny Depp. Have you ever thought this, looking at the evidence in the case?
I mean, the timing of it was definitely something that was brought up in the case, and I think that it was noted properly for that purpose, because it all does kind of feed into, you know, this idea that she has the motivation, the incentive to create this whole hoax about the DV, and the back and forth and the redlining of the actual article itself showed she also had the ambition and the will to make that happen. So not just the incentive, but the will, and she was actually pushing for that particular result so that it could benefit her, along with the Aquaman release and everything else. She knew that the cameras were on her for a period of time. How long can you extend that wave? Use politics.
Yeah, and I think that reads like I did, which I only ever assumed that the closeness and proximity to the release is essentially damning, that it's showing what would be the equivalent of like motive for doing it in this particular way. This seems to me like this person thinks that you could read it as absolving in some respect. But I didn't really have malice. I was just out for myself. It's like
it was just to benefit herself. But how does that go against actual malice?
I don't know. I don't think it does.
Yeah, no, you're right. The logic there does not cut out.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff, because like, again, this is going out in an article. This is what you say, and you say, I mean, I guess I could contort myself into that, but that is not my intuitive read of what was presented there, and I don't think the lawyers have presented that. Now, people talk about this in our chats on Legal Bites all the time. The mutual abuse claim has proven controversial.
Yep.
Some experts say that mutual abuse is a myth. We've heard that in our chats. And that Depp and Heard's dynamic was one of reactive abuse. We heard that from Dr. Hughes, with power imbalances in which Depp had the upper hand. And I don't, I'm not reading whole articles here. Usually I say I'll link it in the description. I guess I will. I'll go back and link these in the description because I think it's useful. But we get differences of opinion here that kind of run the gambit, which I think is good reporting. It's funny. Entertainment Weekly, I don't usually think of as bastion of reporting. This might be my favorite kind of handling of multiple factors here. Mm-hmm. So both partners were egregious in their behaviors, and neither seems to realize their culpability, which is a really interesting take on what we've seen, which is like, not only are we not getting accuracy necessarily, we're also not getting psychological kind of accuracy from either side. And that this is, I think, the version that gets you to the jury throws its hands up in the air and says, I'm not awarding anything to anybody. A different doctor says power has objective and subjective components. A relationship can be mutually abusive in that each partner may be emotionally or physically abusive to the other. But if there is a power imbalance in the relationship due to strength, wealth, status, intelligence, and so on, the more powerful person may be the abuser, but not necessarily so. And I wanted to frame this one for a couple of reasons. One, that sentence actually doesn't say anything at all. Like that is the lawyerist of lawyer quotes ever. Yeah, Rob.
That sentence is also the most accurate. It's the most correct because, from a divorce attorney's perspective, everyone goes in and alleges that their spouse is committing some act of abuse. And we try these cases back and forth. And every single relationship is so case specific that you can't just create some generalized term and say that it does or doesn't exist. That's the thing about this trial that's so unique. This trial takes a relationship and shows you the intricacies of divorce law on a grand scale, and it shows you, and the lesson you should take away that the media is missing, as judged kind of by this article where some people are trying to pick whether something does or doesn't exist, is that every relationship is different. They're all different.
Yeah. And you can have someone that comes from a certain level of power and wealth and whatnot that the other one doesn't, but that other person can also find ways of manipulating that and wielding other forms of power. You can have different forms of power that can either counteract or overshadow one another.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was missing in the testimony. I still am missing in the testimony. Is like you get this testimony that says something like an unfounded allegation of infidelity can be abuse, right? And I don't think that's wrong. But I also think that it has to be, certain qualities that are not just, hey, one time I accused somebody of stepping out on me, like that is in and of itself abusive. It's repeated. It's the way it's done. And the psychologist only can go so far, which is why I think when we discuss it, is there abuse here on both sides, that kind of thing. It gets interesting because just nakedly, yes, Johnny Depp uses some bad words. Johnny Depp says a bunch of things. Amber Heard is on tape saying, I threw pots and pans and I hit you and these various things. And what is abusive and what is reactionary and all this stuff? I think Rob, I don't think I can say it better than you. which is that like you have to parse this stuff out. The psychologists and the generalities and the statistics and this kind of stuff can only go so far. But it does come across in this kind of context as, okay, so that doesn't commit to anything, which is fine. But that's the lawyer. By the time you get to but not necessarily so, it's like, but everything I just said, it may not apply. Then we get some Me Too stuff. With more voices calling out pervasive harassment and abuse in Hollywood and beyond, jurors have shown a greater tendency to defer to women who allege to be victims of abuse.
Yep.
And I highlighted this because, yeah, I can tell you my tendency, I can feel it in me, is to not want to say you're lying.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that exists. I don't know that that's me too. It's just like the person I am, but I can tell you that exists in me. And, you know,
and I think that's a trend that has been really reinforced in recent years.
Yeah.
So I think that there of course were those that already felt that way, but that also is a trend that has been very much strengthened in the past few years.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I should have highlighted this. Depp's case is built around the same narrative as Heard's, Taylor contends. He's not only disputing her public claims to be the victim of abuse, but he's claiming to be the victim of abuse himself. Right, which is one of the more interesting aspects of this is big chunks of his case were establishing himself as a victim of abuse. He is in essence making his own Me Too claim. Are jurors willing to let him make an abuse claim too, or do they see it as victim blaming? This will come down to both credibility and evidence. And I think that's a perfect description of what we have seen, because I started out here saying it'll be muddy middle. And I think Amber Heard's testimony and Johnny's testimony is the two sides, rightly or wrongly, have put you in a place where you straight up have to pick a winner. You straight up have to.
There is no muddy middle.
Yeah. And I think that's a great, in terms of strategy, in terms of actually having a chance to win the case, I think that is a great win for Johnny Depp's team.
100%.
That's not, I'm not saying winning the case. I'm just saying like that's the only way he could.
You know what makes me mad about how this article is written is these last two paragraphs where they shift the blame on jurors. They have now taken jurors and they have said if the juror decides something, the juror is deciding it based on something other than the facts and the evidence. That's the suggestion by these last two paragraphs. Jurors are the ones that are the fact finders. They are the ones that have the ability to process all of the information that's given to them, and they are deciding what is or is not factually true. Your opinions on why they did that are your opinions. You are not them. They are the ones who've heard it. They are the ones who did it. It's a terrible position to be in. Stop blaming them before they've even decided.
I think that is a totally fine critique. And yeah, you could see this is the consultant, right? You see a certain view of jurors as particularly random computer generating outputs, right? Like that it's, you know, it's all they are is a thing that you put data in and something pops up. And if it's not what you wanted, well, then maybe they're not accepting his claim because they see it as victim blaming, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a great point, Rob. Absolutely. Taylor expects the volatile audio recordings between Depp and Heard to feature in Depp's team's closing argument. One point I expect to hear from the Depp team in closing is that with the hours and hours of secret recordings, there are no recordings of abuse, and jurors have also heard Amber Heard admit to some level of abuse herself. I tend to agree with that, but I think it was you, Rob, that points out. I mean, like this is the evidence of absence. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence kind of scenario, right? So, yeah, I expect them to say, "Hey, you document everything," and you know, with Australia as described, I think we had other panelists talk about this. How could you just take pictures of the furniture and not yourself? And here with audio that goes for, what is there actually, like 8 hours of audio?
Something like that.
We don't have that Johnny Depp hauls off and hits you. And I think that's worth noting, even though it seems hard to
and the thing is that, like, you know, like you mentioned, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. However, when you frame things in such a way to suggest that you have evidence to show it, then the absence of evidence does become evidence of absence.
I
always have to think of that one through too.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, and Rick, that's your own words. I mean, when she was testifying and she was saying, and I remember I took a photo of this one, and your immediate analysis was, well, you didn't show me the photo of that. You're a liar. Like
that one goes out. Yeah, I did. I said that story. I can't count that story. Yeah. You took a photo. It was in your control. And then it doesn't pop in. Okay. That one's out.
It's because it seems like her suggestion about having a photo is then deceptive.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't believe you about this entire sequence of events because she says it's a good photo, right? I can't remember the language. It's like, oh, this one really showed it.
The other cool observation of this one is how strategically Johnny Depp's team played this, and they did it fantastically. So she is notorious for these self-bolstering statements. She will put an email to her mother or a text message to her friend and say, "Oh my gosh, this is horrible," and then she will try to then reintroduce that while she's testifying about it to make it more credible. Same thing with the whole, I took a photo of this, and yeah, I remember I took a photo, but then not produced a photo. And Johnny Depp's team have kept out all of those secondary statements, whether it's the photo, whether it's the text message, all these self-serving statements. So now Amber Heard is left to sink or swim based on her testimony given one time, and we see how that's going. It's just not playing.